All right, good morning, everybody. We'd like to start this session on blockchain and the environments. My name is Joel Paula, and I'll be moderating today's session. I am part of the Directorate for Financial Affairs here at the OECD. A lot of my work has been in the infrastructure finance and infrastructure investment fields, where we also touch on a lot of environmental issues, sustainability, and also the social context. So a lot of the work in infrastructure, of course, is important for environmental impact. Today's session, we're going to cover a number of topics, and I wanted to just say some opening remarks to help set the stage for the conversation. Environmental challenges reach across political boundaries as our air, oceans, forests, and clean water require trust and responsible stewardship. We were all entrusted to make sure future generations can benefit from these resources as much as current ones. In order to meet the challenges we face, particularly regarding climate change and biodiversity protection, we need game-changing approaches to foster environmental sustainability. Regarding climate change, harnessing new technologies and innovations to meet these challenges is a key component to accelerating the low-carbon transition and to mitigate the effects of climate change. Placing trust and authority in decentralized governance structures like blockchains could revolutionize our environmental stewardship in areas like natural resource management, climate change policy and action, consumer choice, and also steering financial flows. There is also a greater opportunity to harness new sources of data on sustainability that could help steer public policy, climate finance, and behavior. A recent survey from EdHec Institute found that 36% of institutional investors now consider ESG to be a first-order question, possibly at the expense of performance in infrastructure investment, which is more than double what was reported in 2016. There clearly is a growing demand for genuine and verified data on environmental factors to help guide investor choice. We're working at the OECD through the newly established Blockchain Policy Center and in events like today's forum to bring ideas to the forefront, to governments, to the public sector, to the private sector, and to academia. A newly established initiative at the OECD called Strategic Policies for Sustainable Infrastructure seeks to bring together many capabilities across policy dimensions, serving as a platform for governments, members of the private sector, and academia to advance policy work on sustainability and key infrastructure services. With trust as a central theme for today's conversation to improve environmental stewardship, be it building confidence in supply chains, transparency to climate action and accountability, or new ways to transfer value, ownership, and data, this panel will explore such synergies such as emissions trading markets, renewable power markets, biodiversity and natural resource management, and we'll also talk about new business models in a lot of these contexts. We need to learn how to, or we need new ways to incentivize environmentally sustainable activities. Now, as you may also see by the title of this session, Blessing or Curse, and many of you who maybe attended events on blockchain itself, there are often questions about the sustainability of blockchain as a technology. So I'd like to begin with this question, and what I'll do is I'll introduce panelists as we cover various topics. After that, I'll open up to the questions from you all to react to some of what you've heard, and then we'll have more of an open discussion and steer towards the end, towards policy and interventions that could help foster an environment for sustainability in blockchain. So I'd like to begin by introducing Apolline Blandin, who is Research Manager, Cryptocurrency and Blockchain Technology for the Cambridge Center for Alternative Finance. And Apolline will talk about the recently launched Cambridge Bitcoin Electricity Consumption Index, which is a real-time estimate of the amount of electricity consumed by the Bitcoin network, and try to bring some rigor and some in-depth discussion about the environmental footprint of blockchain, cutting through a lot of the media that we see and a lot of the information that we see in the media that maybe does not have the rigor that's needed in order to understand the issue at hand. So I'm going to let Apolline talk about that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Joel. So I lead the cryptocurrency and blockchain research program at the Cambridge Centre for Alternative Finance. So for those of you who are not familiar with the CCAF, I'm just going to give you a quick background of what we do. Do you know if we can get the slides for the... Slides. Just waiting for the slides. But in any case, so the Centre was created in 2015 to look at any payment channels that emerge outside of the traditional financial system. So we look at crowdfunding, P2P lending, and in 2016 we started a team focusing on cryptocurrency. And so we also work very closely with regulators, so we're currently developing an online course for regulators for fintech and regulation with the support of the OECD. Do you know how to move the...
It should be all right.
Doesn't seem to work. Oh yeah, great. And so what we do with my team is we conduct annual survey of the ecosystem to track any evolution and emerging trends. So the way it works is we have online surveys that we send to companies operating in the space, and so we collect these non-publicly available data and we combine them with publicly available resources. So we have one benchmarking study focusing on the cryptocurrency and public blockchain ecosystem, and another one focusing on enterprise blockchain. We also recently launched a first edition of the regulatory landscape of the crypto asset ecosystem, which I can kind of discuss a little bit later. The thing is, the crypto asset space evolves very quickly, and it's very hard to track the evolution. So we're moving towards a more real-time analysis strategy. And so the first tool we developed for that was the Cambridge Bitcoin Electricity Consumption Index, which is a real-time estimate of the electricity consumed by the Bitcoin network. Again. Okay, so many of you might have come across this type of headlines, which portray Bitcoin and other cryptocurrency relying on proof-of-work mining, contributing to climate change and global warming. So that's one side of the debate. And on the other side, you have defenders of the Bitcoin network who will argue that Bitcoin lead and drive the green revolution. So obviously, there is some nuance within this debate, and so that was the aim of our research project. And we also wanted to provide an alternative to existing index on the electricity consumption of Bitcoin. So what we did is we adopted a bottom-up economic approach relying on a methodology developed by Mark Bevans, which basically look at all type of hardware available and calculate their efficiency. And then we calculate the profitability threshold of all of them and correlate that with the hash rate. Sorry, it doesn't seem to work. Okay, we'll skip the live demo because I'm not sure it's going to work. And so that's kind of the real-time estimate. So currently, I think the figure is a bit higher, so it's 75 terawatt-hour per year. And the model is very much dependent on the electricity cost. So for now, we fix the electricity cost at 5 cents USD per kilowatt-hour, but obviously we acknowledge that there are some variation between regions. And so what you see is that we calculated what we call the upper bound, which is the absolute maximum of electricity that can be consumed by the Bitcoin network, and the lower bound, which is the absolute minimum. And in between, we have what we call our best guess estimate, which is what we think is the more or less or close electricity consumption of the Bitcoin network. We also provide an interpretation page where we allow people to put this figure into context, because very often if you tell someone 75 terawatt-hour per year, it doesn't really mean anything. But obviously it's very tricky because there is no, Bitcoin has a very unique value proposition, so you cannot offer a fair comparison by comparing it with what country consume, for instance. And so this is the first step to answer the sustainability question about proof-of-work mining and crypto and Bitcoin's electricity consumption, because having the electricity consumption index doesn't tell you how much Bitcoin actually contributes to the global warming. So the second step will then be to understand the geographic distribution of hashing facility across the world and obtain their energy mix to then be able to provide an estimate of the carbon footprint. And so to do this, there are two different approaches. So what we started to do is to collect information about hashing facilities that we've been able to identify. So that's the map that we published last December 2018. But obviously, a lot of these activities are also not necessarily public. So what we're doing is we're engaging a lot with mining pool operators, hasher facility, electricity providers as well, to identify the location of other hashing facilities. And based on that, and then on the different energy mix the different hashing facilities are using, we will be able to hopefully provide a more realistic figure of the carbon footprint of Bitcoin. That's it for my introductory remark. Thank you.
Thank you, Apolline. Now, have you come across in your work, different innovations that are helping to deal with this question of energy consumption? Notably, there are other examples of DLTs out there. There are other protocols that are being developed. Do you see promising technologies besides the proof of work concepts that are helping to address this issue?
Yeah, so very often, people would think that this is an argument in favor of other consensus mechanisms like proof of stake. There are, several misconceptions here. First is that proof of work mining is not about just processing transaction. It also contributes to the whole security of the network. So when you move towards other consensus mechanism, then you have to answer the question, what is the security of that network? And then the other factor is that a lot of proof of stake, currently implemented proof of stake, are not purely proof of stake mechanism. And they often rely on centralized solution in case of the network being blocked. So we call that checkpoints. So there are, in theory, proof of stake is supposed to be more environmental friendly, and so their proposition is to replace electricity cost with security deposit as a deterrent. But again, this is the theory, and we have to see how it actually materializes in practice.
Thank you. And a lot of the projections that we've seen, where countries, like when you pointed out, the comparison to countries' consumption, they keep on getting larger and larger. And the projections, some of the projections that we've seen may not be realistic. Can you maybe shed some light on where you see the future of sustainability within the Bitcoin network itself, but also maybe in other cryptocurrencies?
Yeah, so I think the sustainability question, again, to answer it, we will need to have a clearer picture of the distribution of the different hashing facilities and the type of energy they're using to power the machines. Because, for instance, you have a lot of facilities based in North America which are relying 100% on renewable energies. Now, we know that in some region in China, they might rely more on coal, or also hydropower in Sichuan. So again, we need to get a clearer picture on that to then be able to answer the sustainability question.
Okay. So then it seems like it's a question of data that's underlying a lot of these transactions.
Yeah.
Great, thank you for those insights. I'm going to next move on to Mr. Alastair Marke, who is Director General of Blockchain and Climate Institute. He's also going to touch on some of the discussions about blockchain, specifically Bitcoin, and its environmental footprint. He's also going to walk us through some interesting use cases in the renewable energy sector for blockchain financing and also for trading power. So Alastair, thank you.
Hello, good morning, everybody. Bonjour. So welcome to this session. So in order to answer the question from Joel regarding the environmental footprint of blockchain, I would like to talk about the fact that it costs more to mine a Bitcoin than to buy one outright in a lot of countries because of the cost of electricity. So as in layman term, blockchain is a distributed ledger or a shared set of data. What makes cryptocurrency like Bitcoin or Ethereum come to life is the way in which all computers in their networks work together and agree over and over, day after day, that what the blockchain says is true. To this end, blockchain uses an algorithm called consensus mechanism that is a proof of work, or what we call mining. This process consumes so much energy. But this proof of work is not the only method of reaching agreement on blockchain. Many technologists are actually exploring a number of alternatives to address this energy consumption problem. ROC, Ethereum, MIT, Cornell, IBM, Intel, to name a few, are racing to develop some green blockchain solution as well. Energy-efficient blockchain could process significantly more transactions per second at minimal cost, while accommodating an ever-expanding user base. An alternative that could replace the proof-of-work system or mining is proof-of-stake, S-T-A-K-E, not S-T-E-A-K. Whereas a proof-of-work rewards participants for spending computational resources. A blockchain that use proof-of-stake, or what we call POS, would select validators based partly on the size of the respective monetary deposits, their stake, and a lottery system. That is, the more coins you owned, the better chances of being chosen to mine them. This would be massively quite energy efficient, but the concept is still unproven at large scale yet and needs to be tuned further, to be honest. But I want to turn this energy efficiency problem to a renewable energy investment opportunity in the blockchain era. So I'm mulling over the concept that could potentially combine blockchain mining regime with the trading of renewable energy certificates, REC in short. What if we validate computers? What if validating computers are chosen based on the RECs registered within a parallel energy blockchain network? I guess this could energize many energy-related digital currency system and scale up renewable energy development in many countries to address a potential catch-22 situation. When it comes to energy, do you want me to talk about some aspect of future energy system, right?
Sure.
Yeah. So within the Blockchain Climate Institute, we support governments in the deployments of blockchain and emerging digital technologies in a number of climate change policy areas. So renewable energy is one of the flagship areas in which we're working. There are a number of ways blockchain could be used in the future energy system, in our opinions. First is the decarbonization of electricity. So blockchain could facilitate better mechanisms for renewable energy certificates through providing trust and transparency in the proof of origin. Secondly, it is about integrated technology. We believe that blockchain can provide the architecture needed to integrate many different smart technologies for an efficient and green energy system. These will include electric vehicles, EVs, smart meters, renewable energy generators, such as solar panels. The third thing here to talk about is the microgrids and local energy markets. Blockchain technologies provides potential for applications which can support the transaction for the local production and local consumption of energy. Then leads us to the most important aspect of this space, that is the renewable energy financing. So if we can tokenize the renewable energy project investment through a blockchain-based platform, then we could potentially multiply the scale of capital we could potentially mobilize for renewable energy projects worldwide. So, so how can energy be tokenized? Apple has talked about cryptocurrencies, which were the first perfect example to use blockchain, specifically Bitcoin. With cryptocurrencies, not necessarily Bitcoin, but a lot of other coins that you can imagine, these tokens are exchanged digitally and have a certain value attached to them. It is therefore a logical step for a token to also be used in the energy markets. There are different uses of energy tokens. They can be for investment or for simply determining value, such as monetary value. And tokens do not necessarily have to represent monetary value and could potentially represent only, say, social points. For example, we can equate one token to 1 kilowatt of energy, depending on the community in which we want to put that energy tokens for an experiment. Yeah, so this is basically the main part I'd like to share this session.
Great, thank you. And are you aware of some startups, maybe some consortia or businesses that are already operating in this space in terms of energy trading, certificates of origin for green power, etc.?
Yes, in BCI we have a renewable energy working group, and some of our members actually runs a EU funded research called NRG Coin. and NRG coin means energy coin literally. And I know that they are doing this with a lot of stakeholders, including distributed DSO, district supplied operator, and district supply operator, I think, and some other utilities in order to transform the way that local renewable energies are rewarded in terms of its consumption. So, and again, at the same time, there's another startup called WePower. They do similar things, if I understand correctly. And another example is Juliet. Is another example of energy token use case based in Amsterdam, and it works similarly to the use of Bristol pound, created in Bristol in the UK, which is a local currency to support independent local businesses. So these cases are quite interesting indeed, as they bring additional social elements to tokenization of energy and involve all the stakeholder. Partly to also increase the level of social cohesion that we would like to see.
Great, thank you. Just a word to the audience. If you have questions, keep them in mind, and after we do the introductory remarks from panelists, I'll come back to you for any reaction to panelists' opening remarks. With that, I'd like to move on to Mr. Hugh Morris, who is the CEO of Chainsey. He'll be talking about emissions trading systems and the potential blockchain solutions to operationalize emissions trading markets, particularly tackling some important issues like frauds in these markets. So, Hugh, thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. It's a delight to be in the sanity of Paris. It's obviously a challenge for me coming from the UK to claim to have any coherent view to say on anything. So I recognise I'm starting in a fairly deep hole, but I will try and steer clear of politics and stick to technology. So I want to speculate a little bit on where I see an application for blockchain technology, and we won't dive into the rabbit hole of blockchain versus MDL versus smart ledger versus everything else, but suffice it to say a medal-proof solution to holding energy trading certificates. There are a number of energy trading schemes around the place. The largest, in inverted commas, is across the EU. Having said that, when you look at it closely, whilst there is an EU-wide registry, it is up to individual countries, some of which do it centrally, some of which do it distributed regionally, to hold and issue trading certificates, which typically are done industry by industry on a cap-and-trade basis, i.e. there's an overall cap that the government sets at a level that's below, in theory at least, the current consumption, and industry by industry, the major players in those industries get handed out certificates that are inadequate for their current carbon production, so they either have to cut their carbon or they have to find someone else who is below their carbon threshold and buy certificates from them. So far, so good. But let me cast you to a cold January day in Prague a number of years ago. And in the offices of the company OTE that has been charged by the Czech government in running the energy certificate for the Czech Republic, there is a bomb alert and the building is evacuated. And the police rush in to check and clear the building. In among the police are a number of nationals who turn out to be from Calabria, who have nothing to do with the police but are dressed similarly, who go into the offices of the energy trading certificates and find spreadsheets on PCs which are open, whereupon they neatly remove €7 million worth of trading certificates which before the close of play are sold on the spot market. This only comes to light the following morning when a legitimate certificate holder phones up and says, "Where's my certificates?" They disappeared overnight. So this critical measure of an instrument for climate control is typically across the world, and particularly across many parts of the EU, in particularly the south and the east, is badly controlled. And I think it's fairly clear to see that where there's a certificate, where there's a trading mechanism, where there's a need to hold a record of an important asset, there is an obvious blockchain application. And as I said before, whilst there is an EU-wide registry, that registry has no independent processing. It simply receives the output from the national regimes. So if we're going to embark on these sorts of quite important initiatives to use market forces to deliver an environmental benefit, I would suggest to those involved that thinking about blockchain, because of its inherently secure features, because it's hard to mess about with, it's hard to hack into, that this would be a suitable application. Now, having said which, in terms of energy consumption, Bitcoin is right at the cream of the crop. My little company, we have just celebrated our blockchain's 21st birthday. It was written in 1998. It does about 1 trillion transactions a day. It's very low energy use, and if anyone cares, after this session, I'm quite happy to explain how it works. So I would suggest that it is those fast, cheap types of applications for blockchain that would be suitable for usage in some of these important environmental initiatives. Thank you.
Thank you, Hugh. Just a quick follow-up question. I guess we can say that there's moderate success in some emissions trading schemes. I wanted to also ask about potential blockchain applications at the international level, so talking about registries for carbon emissions, such as administered from the UNFCCC. Do you think that there's also an opportunity to operationalize the way, on treaty carbon emissions?
Absolutely. Anywhere you've got a ledger, and a ledger is simply a list of entries that contain some information that you subsequently wish to retrieve, then clearly blockchain is a suitable application. And indeed, the more that there are multiple participants who are contributing or wanting access to the information, then very much the neutrality and independence of a blockchain, or potential neutrality and independence of a blockchain that is open and that is therefore accessible, are very attractive, I think. And I think if we're looking for use cases, given that blockchain is sometimes accused of being a solution in desperate search of a problem, I think where you start to see multiple entities with ledgers that need secure transmission and access and writing to, then they all look very good to me as candidates for blockchain.
Great, thank you. I'm going to move on to our last speaker, Ms. Marianne Haar, Director of Sustainable Digital Finance Alliance. Marianne is going to cover some interesting use cases for crypto governance models looking at biodiversity and nature conservation. So Marianne, if you would, please.
Thank you. Just 2 words of background of who is the Sustainable Digital Finance Alliance. We are a not-for-profit incorporated in Switzerland. We were launched 2 years ago as a public-private partnership between Ant Financial and UN Environment Program. And our mission is to use fintech, so broader than necessarily only blockchain, to scale green finance, so finance for nature and for the Paris Agreement. And one of the reasons why we work with China and Ant Financial is they have in their application the Ant Forest app, which has mobilized 500 million Chinese to go around and plant trees. So that's a high potential impact use case that we are inspired by. Today I'm going to talk about biodiversity and blockchain for biodiversity finance. It's a much less mature space than application of blockchain in renewable energy. We don't have the same legal framework. We will have a new deal for nature coming up next year. So that market is going to be shaped. But if you look at just the investments into green bonds, and you only have 5 to 10% of that, that's investments into nature. And that's not been blockchain-based bonds, so they have not been in a digital form. And you could say that really our conservation finance is totally broken down, and that comes to a governance that doesn't work. We all see the Amazon on fire these days, and we all have biodiversity goals, whether you're in the EU or another region that we are not at all reaching. And sort of at the heart of the governance is a lack of trust and traceability that your biodiversity investments and assets are really transferred as they need to, but also screwed disincentivized structures, behavioral structures. So you're rewarded to cut down the rainforest, you're not rewarded to protect it, right? And there blockchain really comes in with some game-changing thinking, and what I'm going to present to you is much more forward-looking, since there are very few use cases in this space as it is. But just looking at how blockchain can be applied to our existing ways of trying to unlock and protect biodiversity. One of the more mainstream policy instruments is biodiversity offsets. So that is basically if you do a chain of hotels here, and you take out X amount of biodiversity, you have to offset it with someone else providing that biodiversity somewhere else. OECD has done loads of work on what makes these biodiversity offset schemes successful. They have a huge potential to scale, and blockchain can definitely help them do that, especially on the reporting and verification of that these biodiversity offsets or assets are actually being invested in. So that's the traceability part, and of course there blockchain would need to work with adjacent technologies or remote sensing technologies. And that could include some parts of automated data harvesting. And what is really interesting, what we saw recently, just a few months ago, is that Commonwealth Bank of Australia just issued their bio token, which is basically doing exactly that, digitizing biodiversity offsets, offering them in a marketplace, connecting buyers and sellers. This is a pilot, but still the idea from the CBA is really that at one point in time, you as a person can go in and invest your savings in a piece of biodiversity asset and thereby unlock more financing into this space. This is the first pilot we've seen thus far, but it is helping us to push the thinking, and there's no reason why it couldn't emerge in many other jurisdictions. Another interesting case I would like to share with you is really the Bank of Code, which is a game-changing way of looking at biodiversity conservation paradigm. Because of the fact that we incentivize cutting down biodiversity by rewarding it financially, our main paradigm has been protection and conservation, right? So sort of just making these preserved areas. So what Bank of Code is doing is totally trying to shift that. It's actually identifying, starting with the Amazon, saying let's map all the DNA of all the biodiversity in the Amazons and put that on the blockchain, so a Bank of Code. And that it can be open for commercial and scientific use. Whoever goes in to use it will then pay for it with a token, so that you can trace any sort of knowledge about that DNA shifting hands or being used, and that can be traced back to where that DNA comes from, so it's the local community that can get the rewards back. So that's an extremely exciting approach to applying blockchain to totally rethink the paradigm of conservation finance and biodiversity. Of course, that really cries out to policymakers, because at least just for the Amazon, which is the first case, of course that requires collaboration across jurisdictions. That requires a blockchain-based platform that can be used across jurisdictions. And of course, there are quite heavy upfront costs in terms of mapping out all the DNA, but it can really unlock an entirely new bioeconomy, an entirely new way of looking at biodiversity. So let me stop here.
Great, thank you, Marianne. I think an important angle that you captured in what you said is mobilizing behavior, or mobilizing consumers and influencing behavior. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you've seen maybe the example that you gave in Australia, early reactions and indications of how consumers are taking up these technologies.
I think definitely that's what the blockchain space is pretty good at, is behavioral tokens and rewarding, giving new types of incentives. So we see quite a lot. Actually, it's not a crowded space. crypto governance for biodiversity, but where we see some innovations, early days innovations, is exactly in incentivizing behaviors. So we see tree coin and these types of coins that try to reward you by you plant a tree in your garden, you take a picture, you get some rewards from it. And CBA at the moment, it's mainly connecting buyers and sellers. It's a pilot, it's so new that it's not making everybody access it as a sort of become a biodiversity token asset owner. But we have seen with the ant forest example and others where 500 million people are planting trees to offset their carbon footprint. That is not a blockchain-based solution, but it might as well be a blockchain-based solution. It could. And I think policymakers could really play a role in this space. I mean, we could have behavioral biodiversity policies. Why not? Why do we have such an old-fashioned taxation system? Why couldn't we all go in and do our natural accounting like we do our tax accounting, so that we would all have water credits every year, and if we exceed those water credits, we can trade them with our neighbor who takes shorter showers than we do, or if we plant trees, like in the Chinese constitution, you are obliged as a citizen to plant a number of trees a year. Why couldn't we have that? And then we could have a sort of a tree marketplace. If I live in the city, which I do, and I cannot plant 3 trees, Alastair, he lives in the country and he could plant 3 trees. Or I could say I'm just going to pay more in taxes because I'm not going to plant these trees. And I could, we could definitely have policymakers being part of innovating how we invest and incentivize different behaviors related to biodiversity.
Great, thank you. And just one more follow-up question. You know, I guess in the rollout of any new business model, in untested markets, there are always risks associated with uptake, etc. Can you explain maybe some of the risks associated with the blockchain-powered approach?
I think there's definitely. I mean, this comes into a very sensitive area, because you will have some pushback in terms of, is this commodification of nature, and do we need that? I think we already have huge commodification of nature. We have just everybody going to grab in really weak governance regimes. So I think that can definitely be a pushback. And if you go into sort of the behavioral policy space, we also have, we would also need to discuss that quite a lot in countries in terms of sort of data ethics and what do we want. And especially with the blockchain where it's basically a Twitter for all transactions, right? Everything is open and public, and do we want that? How do we want to design it? And I think especially sort of, how are these platforms, are these going to be public sector-led? Are they going to be private sector-led? Are they going to be public-private sector-led? And how can we have them speak, so be interoperable between countries? Because most of the biodiversity doesn't respect national borders. So to make these trading schemes work, we would need probably to test them in smaller geographies, because testing them at EU level would sort of kill them in the beginning, I think, because it would be too difficult. But they would definitely need to have some sort of scaling model that's probably thought outside of the national logic.
Very good, thank you. Okay, now we've gone through introductory remarks from all the panelists. I wanted to open it up to you, the audience, to see if you had any questions and reactions. So please.
During the presentation, the speech of, we have listened a lot about the Bitcoin and the mining and how being the energy. But if we should thinking about environment, because the story of Bitcoin and what's happened with energy after 8 years, it's similar like to discuss on internet about the role of FTP, and after we will have the World Wide Web after 5 years. I mean that in blockchain as technology and not as cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, give us a lot of opportunities for not only for trust and for to use like cryptocurrency, but first of all for transparency. And I want to have your opinion about the transparency, especially because when we discuss about environment, the main problem is for big data from different sources. For example, European Union have Copernicus for environment, space data for environment to measure different. We know for some special events like disaster management, like in South America now. The question is, especially at policy level, what has happened, how we can, you thinking that we can use blockchain at the policy level for transparency, especially because blockchain gives us the opportunity to integrate different databases without to share all the data, but partially. It means that we can have, for example, a global initiative from any organization like your organization, and to using like with transparency all this information.
Thank you for your question. So first, I think we need to clarify what we mean by blockchain, because there are different types of DLT system, and blockchain is a subset of DLT system. And then you have public and permissionless blockchain, and private and permission blockchain. So first, when you put the question of transparency, so what type of DLT system are you using? And very often what we see in governmental application is that they're relying on permission and private blockchain. And so then you have to examine the configuration of the network and who actually have access to the blockchain, because in this type of system you will have network operators who will grant access to the blockchain and will also define the rights and who can actually see the data on the blockchain. So I think before saying that blockchain can solution this transparency issue, we first need to understand who can access actually this information and what type of technology we want to use.
Yeah, I think what blockchain offers us is also to rethink sort of data infrastructure, right? And to rethink it in a way where we incentivize those that are the data providers to actually maintain and keep that data, so it becomes more cost efficient. So if we look at, for instance, biodiversity impacts or green impacts of businesses, I think we can think about it since it's decentralized. So every company, for instance, in Europe could have a green data or biodiversity data wallet, which would have inherent value for them because they can present it to an impact investor or an investor, and then the public sector can just get a node on that blockchain. So you could have access to the data, but you still give the ownership, which would then be, according to the thinking in GDPR and everything, to the lowest level, and they can then monetize and use the data, but you can have oversight and look into it. I think that would be an interesting approach.
Yeah, not only should we rethink the data structure, as Marianne has helpfully raised, but also we have to consider any existing major regulatory barriers that prevents governments from liberalizing or democratizing databases. So for, in BCI, we had emission trading law research program. One of the insights we got from the research process is that from the case of the cyber theft of the involving the carbon units from Prague and a lot of places across the EU, even though the victim company who have filed a claim in the Belgian court requesting the EU to release the relevant details of the database that will help the company trace back where the stolen carbon units are. It wasn't possible because of the regulation 110 of the European Commission directive, which commits the European Commission to the confidentiality principle. It means that no matter what, those transaction data stored on the registry are not going to be opened unless the law enforcement authorities have the need to gain access to it. So if we want to maximize the impact or the value of blockchain in terms of preventing double counting or cyber theft of carbon credit data, energy token data, then we have to convince our ministers to sit together and, as our guest has rightly said, to integrate and open all the databases in order for blockchain or even associated AI application to scan the transaction against a very open platform of databases. Otherwise, blockchain will be no more than technology is handicapped.
Great, thank you. Other questions from the audience? Push the button, the red button.
So it's maybe a bit of a provocative question, and it's primarily addressing you. So when we're talking, I don't know how many of you have actually installed MetaMask on their browser and tried to utilize an actual smart contract before. There's a few of you. But in my experience, the issue with getting people to actually use a blockchain is primarily one of key management. And the key management problem, we had that since the 70s with RSA and PGP, and that didn't go away. And even in the early days of Bitcoin, there have been massive frauds and massive thefts because people couldn't manage their keys and they trusted their keys to a third party. And I don't think these problems will go away no matter what technology we use. We can just as well have a standard database, that's the UNFCCC, for example, that can handle these issues. So the big challenge to me is to find a user-friendly way that allows people to manage their own keys, first of all, before we can even think of giving up national sovereignty over these registries and handing it over to somebody's to an independent third party or no party at all with the blockchain.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And the key problem of, the critical problem of key management is the carbon-based interface. It's the carbon-based component that usually goes wrong. And there is absolutely nothing we're going to do about that. I think the carbon-based component of the chain is with us for some time to come. And yes, it's a real problem because these keys are typically not something that you can memorize like a pin for good reasons. And the moment you write them down and store them somewhere, then they're subject to being able to be removed from being written down and stored somewhere. And equally, inconveniently, if you lose the darn thing, there's no way of getting it back. You have to start again. And I would agree. I think the blockchain itself works perfectly fine, but when you look at the sort of technology ecosystem that you need around it to say, here's the end-to-end process, and here's how the technology works, and here's how the people work, and then here's how they interact, that problem does not go away, and it isn't getting any simpler. I absolutely agree with you.
Maybe just a very brief comment on this point. So we kind of track the evolution of the ecosystem, and obviously key management is one of the key issues. And so we see a lot of service providers trying to develop solutions that are much more user-friendly. So an example of it would be, for instance, Casa, who are trying to allow users to control their own private keys and so self-custody their keys. But yeah, there's a lot of work going on and still a lot of issues that need to be addressed.
There's a question over here, too.
Hi. I have a question for Madame Marianne Hart. Maybe I misunderstood, but I'm just curious why blockchain was chosen as the best solution for creating the idea of creating incentivized behavior change. Because I think the idea behind is very good, but for me it seems like almost using the same model as air miles, that could be there. And I just struggle to understand why exactly blockchain, what kind of problem that would solve in this case.
Are you thinking of one specific example, the CBA example, or just in general? Just in general. Okay. I think what blockchain, and especially sort of that you can reward, or you can basically tokenize behaviors and reward them. So if it's a public sector run reward system for instance, giving all of us a carbon account every year, for instance, right? Then you could measure like how much do you take your car, how much do you cycle, etc., etc. And based on that data, you can then directly with a data token report that to the ministry that's overseeing it, and you could then get some sort of reward, which would be a tax rebate or something. So it's basically the blockchain is just because it's really good at distributing value. So you could get the reward distributed back to you, and basically that it's the distributed system where you could have that reward directly to you. So I think that's why we're seeing quite a lot of not a lot. We're seeing some behavioral token innovations that goes to incentivize new types of behavior that are more either carbon light or are more biodiversity friendly. Just the fact that you can have that new type of reward system that is based on behaviors of whether it's planting a tree or taking a bike or whatever, and you can run that pretty autonomous at a decentralized level. Yeah, but there's no reason why you couldn't have reward. I mean, we have many reward systems that are not blockchain-based, right? We have frequent flyer miles and all these kinds of things. But I guess the nice thing about making it really blockchain-based is that the next step would then be that you could have market-based blockchain-powered platforms where you could exchange those types of. So if you have sort of either some sort of credits, you could then exchange them with others, and then that would make it more liquid, but we're not there at all. So that would more be sort of future-proofing it. But I agree with you, you can have behavioral incentives in non-blockchain powered systems as well, of course.
Great, thank you. Folks in the back row too, please don't be shy. You can come up to a microphone, or even just, I can probably hear you if you talk loudly, so if there's any more questions over here?
Yes, well, we all see that cryptocurrencies are very difficult to regulate. Now, regulating, I think, it is not the way to address, but it could be useful, I believe, to have some kind of incentive and criteria in public offerings to do stuff. To say a criterion is that the solution itself is very sustainable, so that it does not use proof of work or whatever or energy-consuming mechanisms. By default, that is excluded, and that would promote systems and mechanisms that have sustainability high in the priority list. Would that be an idea? Would that work?
Just before delving into the regulatory question, I think there is a need to address this misconception that proof of work mining, is necessarily just contributing to a lot of energy being wasted. It actually contributes a lot to the security of the network in two ways. So the first one is by being a deterrent. So you need proof of work mining to be financially costly to deter attackers to attack the system, right? And they need to find it more consuming or resource intensive to attack the network rather than to contribute to it. And the second aspect is that proof of work mining combats attrition process of old blocks by constantly creating new blocks. So I think as soon as you hear people suggesting to use another consensus mechanism, the follow-up question should be, how do you secure the system and what does the security relies on? And so very often you will find that people will then bring in some centralized solution, which is, supposedly against the purpose of a blockchain. So I think this proof of work question has to be connected to the security of the network. And then in terms of regulation, so then again, it depends on what type of DLT system you want to regulate. So we also conducted a survey of the regulatory landscape. And so what we see is that there are a lot of lack of terminology, standardized terminology across regulators in terms of what is a crypto asset. And so you have different type of approaches. So very often regulators with jurisdiction with a large level of crypto activities have done what we call retrofitting regulation, where they amend existing law to regulate crypto asset activities. And so I assume bringing in like a sustainability question would be kind of another step to take in terms of regulation.
Yeah, I think there are lots of things that could be done. I think it's a good idea. I think a forum like this could bring the industry together to set standards for carbon emissions in crypto mining. You could also regulate, of course, in terms of saying you can only crypto mine with renewable energy, or you could also at the platform level you could reward those that mine with renewable energy higher than those that don't. So I think there are loads of things that are right there. But it's really important that we start to have those conversations. Rather, is it high or low, like we have here, and how much is it? To say, okay, let's actually go and do something about this, so we don't have more blockchains with proof of work, even though it's not necessarily that. But The lighter the carbon footprint, the better.
Yeah, just to supplement what my fellow panelists have said. There might be a few things that particularly the OECD member states should sit together and consider, including an absolutely new regulatory approach that will involve the coverage of new legal actors. So in the current financial or banking law, the financial institutions who bears a lot of regulatory burden in order to survive in this space. But when we when we start to look after cryptocurrencies, definitely we might want to consider involving the coders of the cryptocurrency system in the future regulatory reform, because they will be the persons that will yield a significant impact on the smooth operation of the entire crypto financial system in the future. So these new legal actors have to be covered in future regulations. Another main idea we could consider is to focus the regulator's role on governing the on and off ramp of a blockchain network. So analogically, if we see the data flow on a blockchain network as the moving vehicle on an expressway, and it's unlikely that regulators can stop or control the super fast data flow on this highway, because blockchain is already, by design, a quasi-judicial system where all the things are automated to a certain robust standard. Instead, the role of regulators in whatever sector in the future should probably focus on regulating what data got into the blockchain network, in what format. So that's what I meant by on and off ramp of this super data highway in the blockchain era.
Just to shamelessly promote our little product, I mean, Chainsy is a little blockchain utility, and it's used by multiple applications. So one of the ways of dealing with the potential for fraud is that every block is typically written to by a dozen or more applications. So you'd actually have to interfere with all the applications to interfere with the block. You don't just have to interfere with one application. So that is a low-energy alternative, is actually to start using blockchains in utility mode rather than have a different one for every application.
Okay, so then my follow-up question would be, so who decide who's going to produce the next block and validate the transactions?
It's whatever comes through. So the applications then write into the blockchain, and at that point they are secured, and every block, we just write whatever turns up. And when it turns up, then it is secured, and it's very hard to interfere with. It could have been interfered with in the application before it got to us, but it can't be interfered with very easily after it gets to us, because so many different applications contribute to every physical block that's written.
Okay, well, I'll be happy to discuss this.
Great. Any other questions from the audience? Now's your time. Over here, Rob, please.
Hi, Rob Youngman with the Green Finance Center here at the OECD, and Joel, really interesting session. I have a question first for Hugh. In light of these cases of fraud in the EC and potential application of blockchain with the EU ETS, I'd be curious to know whether there's any real interest being expressed by the EC in blockchain applications, and whether this key issues or challenges around keys has any problem there in getting them to be interested. As an aside, I would say, sorry, this will be a little extended. As an aside, I would say that these cases of fraud, I'm in the environment director, and to my knowledge, these cases of fraud haven't undermined confidence in national accounting systems for carbon, nor in the theory that emissions trading is an economically efficient way to reduce emissions. So just wanted to point that out. So that was the first question for Hugh. And the second question for the panel is you didn't speak directly about carbon offset markets. So Marianne, you talked about potential for biodiversity offsets, which is very important, and our team works on that as well. But there is a voluntary carbon offset market, and I wonder whether there's applications there that could increase confidence in that market. So any reactions there would be interesting. Thanks.
So to take the first question, I have discerned no interest at either EU or national level in taking a step forward by the use of blockchain, and actually just because they're not really thinking about it rather than they've thought about it and they said, hey, key management is too tough, we won't do it for those reasons. So I think it's crying out for at least some investigation, despite the very well articulated issues around key management. And I would urge the national governments, because the EU says, well, we're a central repository, we don't control anything. That all the data is posted from the national governments, however they choose to do it. And there is definitely, without naming names, a geographic spread between low fraud areas and higher fraud areas across the EU.
Yeah, I agree. I think some of the same principles applies as to the biodiversity offset market, that it can bring trust through traceability, both on the buy and supply side of it. And I think also, yeah, exactly, and sort of your oversight office can just have a note on it, and thereby the transparency will definitely increase. And you can also, just with the biodiversity offset market, take that next step and innovate it. And I think carbon offset market is much more mature and much more ready to do that. We now, from most of the telcos, have all our behavioral data, and we could all be assigned a carbon footprint if we want, if we wanted at the national level. So we could even make those markets work for individuals if we wanted, or starting to experiment with that. So I think that's a really interesting application of the blockchain today.
Just at the end there, you hit on a point that I wanted to address in some of the last few moments that we have. We've already been talking about the interventions and the policy and regulatory otherwise actions that are needed. But there's also, bringing it back to data, we talked a bit about a lot of the data that's held in the public realm, but there's a significant amount of data also in the private sector, whether it be mobility data like from Google or telco data, utility side data. So what, in your closing remarks in the last few moments that we have, what are some of the areas you think where OECD governments, et cetera, could help mobilize this information and help foster a partnership, given data privacy rules, et cetera, to use this information for sustainability purposes?
Thank you. I don't know if the initiative can come from the OECD or rather industry participants themselves. So I think we need to have more transparency from them. And so then we need a place to curate and standardize all this data. So I think there are some initiatives happening, among trade association and industry to provide some of that data. So I think that would be the best approach.
I think Appeline is absolutely right. I think this is something that works at every level, from the supranational to the national to the industry sector to the individual organisation. And of course, the only challenge there is lining up all the sort of planets in one horizon, as it were. It becomes quite difficult. So I think, but I also think that just because we can't get it perfect shouldn't stop us starting, and I think that's been some of the advantage of things like the carbon trading. It isn't perfect, it's nowhere near perfect, but at least there's something going on, and at least there's a direction set. And I would certainly see the opportunities for international cooperation to set a number of other areas where similarly, baby steps could be taken, and who knows what could grow from that.
Yeah, I believe that one of the collaboration items we could consider at OECD level is a cross-border judicial cooperation in terms of new legal research around these order of smart contract governance. As more and more smart contracts are used in the business world or in the governance of whatever policy areas to increase the robustness of MROV or all those transaction units, there might be possibilities that some smart contracts are not going to deliver the outcomes that we want it to happen. All those unintended consequences arising from probably miscooked smart contracts deserve special legal solutions, which may or may not go beyond the current legal concept, for particularly contract law in the common law jurisdictions. So it might be quite worthwhile for the OECD countries to adopt a common legal solution to these emerging legal questions around a smart contract governance in order to provide a very favorable environment for more blockchain-related innovation to survive and thrive.
Data about nature is inherently complex. It's much more complex than data about carbon footprinting. And I think that sort of the mix of a complex technology like blockchain and something that's inherently complex like nature to measure is what is one of the biggest barriers for this space to actually grow, and why we see so few biodiversity-based bonds, etc. And I think there policy bodies like the OECD could play a really important role in looking at what are the data sets out there on biodiversity that we can automatically do data harvesting on and automatically upload to a ledger, so that those are the parts of biodiversity that we could most readily do piloting on. And help countries in that, I think, would be extremely useful. And also looking at their existing policy frameworks like the biodiversity offsets, payment for environmental services, etc. And look at what would be the blockchain readiness for these solutions, and what could be some solutions that governments across borders could work on together.
Great, thank you all for those comments. Any last-minute reactions, comments from the audience? Okay, well, I think I'll just say some quick closing remarks. Wanted to thank, of course, the panelists for all of your inputs and for your insights. Very much appreciates this conversation. Also wanted to point out this is the first day of a two-day event, and there will be other sessions that may touch on sustainability issues in blockchain. Notably tomorrow, we have a session on enabling infrastructure investments, sustainable infrastructure investment through blockchain. We're launching a new report that covers this subject matter as well during that session tomorrow. So I encourage you all to attend that and to be active in that conversation. I also wanted to mention some upcoming events here at the OECD. This fall, we will have, through the OECD Center on Green Finance and Investment, a Green Investment and Financing Forum that will be held on the 29th and 30th of October here in Paris. So I encourage you to attend that as well. This event will be more geared towards mobilization of finance, also alignment of investment with climate change priorities, and we will have colleagues from both Environment Directorates, Financial Affairs, and other parts of OECD participating. So thank you very much for attending, and wish you all a good 2 days in the next events. Thank you.
Thank you for a good break.
So we just write stuff.